So next up on Still Worth Reading, a bunch of scrolls found in the Egyptian desert in 1945. Still worth reading. So if you're like me, you might say Christianity has really nothing more to offer us, and I certainly feel that way about it. But there is an esoteric tradition inside Christianity which was suppressed before the lid was put on the teachings and a faith was built out of what Jesus taught. There was an esoteric branch of Christianity that was active, and you can see the presence of it in a veiled way in the Gospel of John, which is the most esoteric of the canonical Gospels. But the narratives of the Bible are mostly devoid of esoteric teachings. Really, it's not that useful from that perspective. That stuff just all got scrubbed out quite early, probably by the early Christian fathers who went on to construct the narratives of the New Testament, and who had their own objectives about that, So for a long time, what those Christian fathers had done, that was Christianity. It was a faith. It was not an esoteric teaching. In 1945, some goatherds found a cache of papyri in the clay jars in a cave near Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is on the Nile. It's more or less about the center of contemporary Egypt. These brothers found this amazing cache of scrolls. They're very well preserved. But they didn't go and report the find or anything like that. They knew the scrolls were of great value. So they made a plan to sell them off one by one very slowly. It was like their retirement plan. So apparently their mother, afraid that the contents of the jars had some magical danger to them, burnt some of the scrolls. Well, one thing led to another, and the brothers quarreled, and eventually the items that they had sold got the attention of interested parties out in the world. And meanwhile, there was war and revolution going on in Egypt. It was a dangerous time. It wasn't until the mid-70s that a full accounting of what the scrolls had in them was made, and their contents was published, translated and published. So the result of all that was something called the Nag Hammadi Library. And you can buy it. It's a huge book. It's quite expensive. I looked at buying it for this segment because I hadn't read it in a while. But printed, it costs about $300 Australian. So I'm going to save you some time and put a link in the description about the online edition. Normally, I much prefer printed books. I just like books. But I think in this case, there are reasons why an online source is really a good option. There's scholarship about the scrolls, and there's other things you can get online. So the part of the library, one aspect to this is that it's 1,000 pages, and some of it may not be that interesting. But the part of the library which I personally consider to be the most important, it's actually really short, and you can read it online easily. So in the same way that the part of the Mahabharata, which is the esoteric part, namely the Bhagavad Gita, is very short, and it's included in a much larger work, the Gospel of Thomas is arguably the most esoteric part of the whole Nag Hammadi collection. And it's embedded in there. It's very short. It's 114 sayings. And so you can easily read those at your leisure online. So anyway, what is the Gospel of Thomas? Well, as I say, it's the oral tradition of what the historical Jesus said. It's not a narrative. it's just a collection of fragments. And that is exactly how a lot of ancient texts, ancient teachers are represented in the historical record. So it aligns Jesus with those ancient sources in the sense that, like you look at Heraclitus, he was represented only as fragments in things that other authors wrote. Aristotle quoted Heraclitus in his works. We don't have Heraclitus, anything he wrote himself, but we have fragments. So this is kind of like that. If we contrast the Gospel of Thomas with the canonical sayings of Jesus, the things in the Gospels, there is overlap. But the Gospel of Thomas has some new things in it, or different things, and more importantly, it says them in a kind of different way. I mean that in two different senses. First of all, there's actually some, possibly new material, but more importantly, there's a lot of things not present. For example, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't mention the crucifixion, the resurrection, the final judgment. It has none of that. There's no faith aspect to it. There's no narrative. It's just wisdom sayings, just little nuggets. And it's the teaching, or perhaps just the remembered spoken part of the teaching of Jesus in a just unadorned fashion. The scrolls were written in Coptic script, which is a sort of bastardized Greek, and that dates them to the 2nd or 3rd century, but the sayings could easily be 1st century. They're really old. They're really closely connected with the historical Jesus. It's true that the translation, the Gospel of Thomas, may be a translation from Syriac. Syriac is basically Aramaic. That's the language that the historical Jesus would have spoken. But they're not 100% sure if Gospel of Thomas is a translation. If it is, it's from Aramaic, direct. Contrast that with, contemporary translations of the Bible. So at any rate, the Gospel of Thomas is a very different slice of early Christianity, and it's different in feel. It shows Jesus not being an object of faith. His teachings are not an object of faith there. But he's a wise man. He's like a spiritual teacher or a guru, something like that. So the Gospel of Thomas is definitely still worth reading. I will close this with some passages from that I think are interesting.
Jesus said, "This heaven will pass away, and the one above it will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will not die. During the days when you ate what is dead, you made it come alive. When you are in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, what will you do?" The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us, how will our end come?" Jesus said, "Have you found the beginning then, that you are looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is. Congratulations to the one who stands at the beginning. That one will know the end and will not taste death."